My hands were trembling, but not from the weight of the crystal wine glass I was polishing. It was the low, venomous whisper from Marco, my manager and my ex, his breath hot against my ear. Another complaint about slow service, Elena. You know what happens when I get complaints. His fingers tightened on my arm, just enough to press on the faint, yellowing bruise he'd left there last week. I kept my eyes down, focused on the endless circular motion of the white linen against the glass, the murmur of the wealthy patrons of Volkov's filling the air like a thick, expensive fog. I could feel the exhaustion deep in my bones, a weariness that went beyond the double shifts and the constant worry about my sister, Sophia. It was the soul-crushing exhaustion of being trapped. He leaned in closer, his smile a predatory curve I knew all too well. Maybe you need a more personal reminder of how to do your job properly after your shift. A cold dread washed over me, a familiar tide threatening to pull me under. I just needed to survive the next 3 hours, collect my tips, and get home. But looking at his smug reflection in the polished glass, I felt something else simmering beneath the fear, a white-hot rage that was getting harder and harder to contain. It's a strange thing, feeling invisible and yet so intensely watched at the same time. I wonder if anyone else out there knows that feeling, of being cornered in your own life while the world just keeps spinning around you. If you've ever felt that desperation, that sense that you're just one push away from shattering, then you know a part of my story already. So many stories like this happen in the quiet corners of the world, in break rooms and behind closed doors, and they never get told. If what I'm sharing with you now resonates, if it makes you feel seen, then I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. Your support helps bring these moments out of the shadows, and leaving a comment to share your own thoughts makes me feel a little less alone in this. It's a small click, but it sends a powerful message that these stories matter, that our voices deserve to be heard. Knowing you're listening gives me the courage to continue, to tell you exactly what happened next, because that night, the quiet corner I was trapped in was about to become the center of a very public, very dangerous stage. Unseen by me, in the restaurant's most secluded booth, sat the man who owned it all. Dante Volkov was a ghost in his own establishment, a name whispered among the staff, but a face recognized by none. He watched the room not like a patron, but like a predator surveying his territory. Dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the dim golden light, he was a portrait of controlled stillness. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his expression unreadable, but his eyes missed nothing. They followed the subtle ballet of the servers, the clinking of glasses, the forced smiles, and they settled for a long moment on the tense tableau near the service station, a manager with a cruel smirk and a waitress with desperation etched into the lines of her face. He saw Marco's fingers dig into my arm, saw the flicker of defiance I tried to hide. A muscle in his jaw tightened, the only sign of his displeasure. He made a nearly imperceptible gesture to the man beside him, his loyal advisor Leo, a silent command that acknowledged the disturbance in his perfectly ordered world. He had seen the first crack in the facade long before the entire thing was about to come crashing down around me. The final push came just as I was delivering a bottle of Chateau Petrus to the mayor's table. It was the most expensive wine in the cellar, a bottle worth more than 6 months of my rent. I was balancing the heavy silver tray, my focus absolute, when Marco stepped directly into my path, a look of feigned surprise on his face. "Watch out, Elena," he exclaimed, just as his shoulder connected with my arm. The tray tilted, a slow-motion disaster I was powerless to stop. The bottle tumbled, hitting the polished floor with a sickening crash that echoed through the hushed dining room. Dark red wine exploded outward, soaking the white tablecloth, the mayor's trousers, and my own apron in a stain that looked disturbingly like blood. Every eye in the restaurant turned to me. The silence was deafening, broken only by Marco's voice, loud and dripping with false sympathy. Clumsy, Elena. So clumsy. This is coming out of your pay, of course. That is, if you still have a job after this. He was enjoying it, feeding on my public humiliation. The shame was a physical blow, hot and sharp. And in that moment, all the fear, all the exhaustion, all the quiet suffering boiled over into a single, blinding point of fury. That was it, the breaking point. The thin thread of my control didn't just fray, it snapped with the sound of thunder. My vision tunneled, the faces of the shocked diners blurring into a watercolor of judgment. All I could see was Marco's triumphant smirk, the face that had haunted my waking hours and my dreams. A raw, primal scream built in my chest, but what came out was action. I lunged forward, my hand raised, every ounce of my desperation and rage channeled into the swing. I was going to wipe that smile off his face, just once. I needed to. But in the fraction of a second it took for my palm to travel through the air, a dark shape moved with impossible speed. A tall, imposing figure stepped from the shadows of a nearby booth, placing himself directly between me and my target. My hand connected not with Marco's fleshy cheek, but with a jawline that felt like it was carved from granite. The slap echoed through the dead-silent restaurant, a sound so sharp and final it seemed to hang in the air. My hand stung, my arm vibrated from the impact, and I stared in horror at the man I had just struck. It wasn't Marco. It was a stranger, a man whose chilling stillness made the air crackle with danger. The world held its breath. I saw Marco's face drain of all color, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost comical. The security guards by the door tensed, their hands inching toward their jackets. I braced myself for the inevitable, for shouting, for violence, for being thrown into the street like trash. But the man I had slapped did not move. He didn't even blink. His dark eyes, intense and unnervingly calm, were locked on mine. There was no anger there, no rage. Instead, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't name. Surprise, maybe? Or a sliver of dark amusement. It was utterly disorienting. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. I flinched, expecting a blow, but his fingers were surprisingly gentle as they closed around my wrist, his thumb coming to rest on the frantic pulse hammering there. He held me for a beat, his gaze searching my face, as if looking for an answer to a question he hadn't asked. Then, without breaking eye contact with me, he finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence like a knife. "Marco," he said, his tone deceptively soft, "you're fired. Get out of my restaurant." The aftermath was a blur of surreal motion. Two large men materialized and escorted a sputtering, ghost-white Marco from the premises without a single word. The mayor and his party were quietly moved to another table, their ruined meal and stained clothes forgotten. The staff, moving with a renewed, fearful efficiency, cleaned up the shattered glass and the spilled wine as if a bomb had been diffused. And I was left standing in the middle of it all, trembling and untethered. My life had just imploded. I had lost my job, assaulted a customer, a terrifyingly powerful one, and the last thread of hope for paying Sophia's medical bills had been severed. This was the bottom. I was drowning. Then the man turned back to me, his presence sucking all the air out of the room. He looked at my stained apron, my tear-streaked face, and the faint bruise on my arm that was now fully visible. He didn't offer pity or condemnation. He simply stated, in that same quiet, authoritative voice, "I'll take you home." It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a command wrapped in a strange, unsettling blanket of calm. My entire world had just been destroyed, and yet this dangerous stranger was holding open a door to a place I couldn't even begin to imagine. The ride home was the longest 10 minutes of my life, a silent, suffocating journey through the glittering city streets that now felt alien and hostile. I sat rigid in the plush leather seat of his car, a vehicle so quiet it felt like we were moving through a vacuum. The man beside me, Dante Volkov, hadn't said a word since his shocking pronouncement in the restaurant. He drove with an unnerving economy of motion, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the shattering glass, the collective gasp, the stinging impact of my palm against his stone-hard jaw. I should have been terrified of him, and a part of me was. But the overwhelming emotion was a dizzying confusion. He hadn't hurt me. He had fired Marco. He had saved me from complete ruin, only to place me in this new, undefined state of peril. When he pulled up in front of my run-down apartment building, a stark contrast to the luxury we'd just left, he finally turned to me. His dark eyes held no readable emotion as he simply said, "Stay inside tonight. Don't open your door for anyone." Then he was gone, leaving me on the curb with the smell of expensive leather and the chilling echo of his warning. The morning light did little to dispel the nightmare. It only illuminated the stark reality of my situation. My phone buzzed with a text from my landlord, a blunt reminder that rent was 3 days late and his patience had run out. An eviction notice was coming. Then came the messages from Marco, a cascade of pure venom. He called me every name I'd ever feared, blaming me for his ruin, for losing his job, for everything. He ended with a promise that my blood ran cold. "You think that big shot can protect you? You have no idea what you've done. I'll make sure you and your precious sister pay for this." The threat hung in the air of my small apartment, thick and poisonous. I looked at the pile of Sophia's medical bills on the kitchen table, a monument to my failure. The number stamped on the top, $2,387 for this month alone, seemed to mock me. I had lost my job, my ex was threatening my family, and I was about to be homeless. The rage from last night had curdled into a thick, choking despair. I had stood up for myself for one brief, explosive second, and in doing so, I had just destroyed everything. A sharp, authoritative knock on the door made me jump. My heart hammered against my ribs as Dante's warning from the night before screamed through my mind. I crept to the peephole, my breath held tight in my chest, expecting to see Marco's furious face or my landlord's impatient one. Instead, I saw a man I vaguely recognized from the restaurant, older, impeccably dressed, with a calm, watchful demeanor. He was the man who had been sitting with Dante Volkov. Hesitantly, I opened the door just a crack. "Ms. Martinez?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. "My name is Leo. I work for Mr. Volkov. May I have a moment of your time?" He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating an intention. He held a thin manila folder, and his eyes flickered past me, taking in the cramped, cluttered apartment with a neutral, assessing gaze. There was no escaping this. Dante Volkov had sent his emissary, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was not a social call. This was the bill coming due for the chaos I had caused in his perfectly ordered world, and I had no way to pay it. I let him in, my hands trembling as I closed the door behind him. He didn't sit, but stood in the center of my small living room, an island of expensive wool and quiet authority amid my second-hand furniture. He opened the folder. "Mr. Volkov is a man who values order, Ms. Martinez. Last night, you introduced a significant element of disorder into his establishment." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "He also has a zero-tolerance policy for certain behaviors. My investigation into the matter, conducted overnight, was quite revealing." He pulled out a series of papers. "Marco Ricci has been skimming profits for 6 months to cover extensive gambling debts to the Antonelli family. He systematically filed false complaints against you and 2 other female servers to create a pretext for docking pay or firing them if they resisted his advances. The incident with the wine was, by all accounts, deliberately instigated by him to humiliate you publicly. Every word was a hammer blow, revealing a depth of betrayal I hadn't even suspected. I felt sick. He knew. This stranger, this dangerous man's right hand, knew everything. He saw the whole ugly, hidden truth of my life. Leo slid the papers back into the folder, his expression unchanging. Mr. Volkov has already resolved the issue with Mr. Ritchie's employment and his outstanding financial obligations. He will not be bothering you again. The finality in his tone was absolute, and I didn't dare ask what it meant. However, he continued, your own situation remains precarious. You have no job, you have significant personal debts. The men Marco owed money to now know he worked at Volkov's, and they may come looking for answers from those associated with him. He was laying out the pieces of my broken life as if it were a business proposal. Therefore, Mr. Volkov is extending you an offer. He requires a personal archivist. The position involves organizing and managing his private library and documents. The salary will be more than sufficient to cover all your needs, including your sister's medical care. A fully furnished apartment is provided, located within Mr. Volkov's private residential tower. For your own security, accepting the position would require you to live on site. It was a lifeline, a golden, shimmering rope thrown down into the abyss I was drowning in, but it felt heavy, like an anchor. My first instinct was a fierce, visceral rejection. No, I said, the word coming out sharper than I intended. I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept. Pride, hot and stubborn, rose up to choke the desperation. I had just escaped one man's control. I wasn't about to willingly walk into another's. I didn't want his charity, his protection, but felt like ownership. I saw the trap for what it was, a beautiful, gilded cage. I don't want to be indebted to him. I'll find another job. I can take care of myself and my sister. Leo listened patiently, his gaze unwavering. He seemed neither surprised nor offended by my refusal. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. He started to turn, but his eyes caught the framed photo of Sophia on the mantelpiece. Her smile so bright it hurt to look at. A flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or simple pragmatism, crossed his face for a fraction of a second before the mask of professionalism slipped back into place. He knew. He was making a foolish choice, a choice born of fear and pride that my circumstances could no longer afford. Just as Leo reached the door, a heavy pounding started, much louder and more aggressive than his had been. 2 large, thuggish men filled the doorway, pushing past him into my apartment as if they owned it. "Where's Morco?" the bigger one growled, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me with a predatory leer. My blood turned to ice. These were them, the Antonelli family's thugs, the vermin Leo had just warned me about. I was frozen, my refusal to Leo turning to ash in my mouth. But Leo didn't move. He simply turned back from the door and sighed, a sound of mild annoyance, as if he were dealing with a persistent stain on a carpet. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dropping to a low, calm register that was somehow more menacing than their shouting, "you have made a grave error. You are trespassing on Volkov property. I suggest you leave now before I am forced to register a formal complaint with your employer." The men laughed, but it was a nervous, brittle sound. The larger man took a step toward Leo, puffing out his chest. "Volkov, we ain't afraid of—" He never finished the sentence. Leo moved with a speed that was utterly shocking in a man his age. It wasn't a flashy fight. It was a brutal, efficient dismantling. A quick jab to the throat, a precise strike to the man's knee that sent him crumpling to the floor with a sickening crunch, and a cold, hard stare at the second man, who was now pale and wide-eyed. Leo didn't even look winded. He adjusted his suit cuff, his expression unchanged. "The offer to leave is still on the table," he said quietly. The second man scrambled to help his partner up, and they practically fell over each other getting out of my apartment, slamming the door behind them. The sudden silence was deafening. I was shaking, leaning against the wall for support. Leo turned back to me, the calm professional once more. "As I was saying," he stated, as if he hadn't just incapacitated a man twice his size, "your situation is precarious. Mr. Volkov's offer is not charity. It is a practical solution to a dangerous problem you did not create, but are now a part of." He walked over to my small kitchen table and placed a sleek black keycard next to the pile of threatening bills. The contrast was staggering. My world of desperate poverty next to this symbol of immense wealth and untouchable power. "The apartment is ready. Your sister's medical records have already been transferred to Dr. Alastair Finch, the country's leading specialist in her condition. Her first appointment is tomorrow. Mr. Volkov has taken care of the cost." My breath hitched. He had gone over my head, already weaving his power into the most vulnerable part of my life. It was manipulative, it was controlling, and it was the most profound act of care I had ever received. The fight went out of me, replaced by an overwhelming wave of exhaustion and a terrifying flicker of gratitude. This wasn't a choice between freedom and a gilded cage anymore. It was a choice between life and death, for Sophia, and maybe for me too. I looked at the keycard, then at Sophia's smiling face in the photo. My pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. With a hand that felt like someone else, I reached out and picked up the keycard. The apartment was less a home and more a museum of a life I could never live. It occupied the entire floor below Dante's own penthouse, a sprawling space of glass and steel and cold white marble that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city I no longer felt a part of. Leo had given me the tour, his voice a calm monotone, as he pointed out the state-of-the-art kitchen, the bedroom with a closet bigger than my old living room, and the private elevator that required the keycard I now carried everywhere. He also laid out the rules, delivered with polite firmness. I was not to leave the building without notifying him first. I was to use only the encrypted phone he provided. All visitors, even Sophia, had to be cleared through his office 24 hours in advance. He called them security protocols. I heard the clanging of cell doors. Gratitude and resentment warred within me, a bitter, confusing cocktail. I had been saved from drowning, only to be placed in a beautiful, sterile aquarium, forever separated from the world by a thick wall of glass, a prize on display for an audience of one. My official job was to be his archivist, a title that sounded both grand and meaningless. The library was my designated workspace, a 2-story sanctuary of dark wood and the hushed, sacred smell of old paper and leather. I spent the first 2 days aimlessly running my fingers over the spines of books written in languages I couldn't read, feeling like an imposter. On the 3rd day, Dante found me there. He didn't mention the job or the chaos I'd caused. He simply stood in the doorway, a formidable shadow against the light, and asked, "How is Sophia?" The question was so direct, so personal, it threw me completely off balance. He told me he had spoken with Dr. Finch, reciting the details of her new treatment plan with a startling fluency. He understood her illness not as a tragedy, but as a complex problem to be solved. He wasn't just a benefactor, he was an investor in her survival. He noticed me shivering in the cool, conditioned air, and without a word walked to a discreet panel on the wall, adjusting the temperature. That small, silent gesture of care was more disarming, a quiet crack in his armor of control. I needed to reclaim a piece of myself,
some small corner of this new life that was solely mine. My rebellion began in the kitchen. I refused the services of the private chef, determined to cook my own meals, to perform a task that felt familiar and grounding. The kitchen itself was an alien landscape of gleaming stainless steel and touchscreen appliances. I was wrestling with a stubborn induction stovetop when Dante walked in, drawn by the smell of burning olive oil. I expected a reprimand or a condescending remark, but he simply took the pan from my hand, turned a dial I hadn't noticed, and the burner sprang to life. For a moment, he was just a man showing someone how to cook, his movements efficient and surprisingly gentle. "You don't have to do this, Elena," he said, his voice low.
"The staff is here to take care of you." My pride flared, hot and defensive. "I know," I snapped back, my voice tighter than I intended. "That's why I'm doing it." I expected anger, but instead I saw a flicker of something in his dark eyes, not quite amusement, but a quiet, unnerving respect for my defiance. The next morning, Leo presented me with a new phone, a sleek black rectangle devoid of any branding. "For your security," he explained, his face impassive. "Your old number has been deactivated. We've transferred your contacts." Another link to my past severed, another decision made for me. I felt a surge of frustration, but Leo's next words chilled me to the bone. "There are men, unpleasant men, who knew of your association with Marco Ricci. Now they know you are associated with Mr. Volkov. They will be curious. This is a necessary precaution." His pragmatism was terrifying. Later that afternoon, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing down at the bustling street below. A black sedan was parked across the road, a generic, forgettable car that nonetheless felt deeply sinister. It hadn't been there an hour ago. Two men sat inside, their faces obscured, not looking at anything in particular, yet their presence felt like a physical weight. They were watching the building. They were watching me. The gilded cage, which I had resented as a prison, suddenly felt like the only thing keeping the wolves at bay. Dante requested my presence for dinner a few nights later. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons, and we ate in a private dining room so quiet I could hear the frantic beating of my own heart. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken questions. He finally broke it, not with personal inquiries, but by speaking of his empire. He described logistics, international shipping routes, and real estate investments with a cold, detached passion. It was a calculated display of power, a reminder of the world I had stumbled into. I felt a reckless urge to push back, to see if there was a man behind the monolith. "Is that all that matters to you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Assets and control?" He paused, placing his fork down with deliberate precision, and his dark eyes locked onto mine. The intensity of his gaze was a physical force. "What matters, Elena," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is protecting what is yours. Everything else is simply a tool for that purpose." The way he looked at me when he said "yours" made it clear he was no longer talking about his businesses. My sense of unease solidified into sharp-edged fear with the arrival of Isabella Volkov. Dante's mother appeared at my door one afternoon, unannounced and flanked by two silent bodyguards. She was an elegant, hawk-like woman with silver hair pulled into a severe chignon and eyes that held the same chilling stillness as her son's. She surveyed my apartment, Dante's apartment, and me with an air of regal disdain, as if inspecting a piece of furniture her son had acquired on a whim. Her questions were sheathed in politeness, but designed to draw blood. Inquiries about my family, my past, my ambitions. "My son has always had a weakness for wounded things," she said, her smile a thin, bloodless line. "He sees a bird with a broken wing and feels the need to mend it.
But he sometimes forgets that strays can carry fleas, or worse, that they can lead the pack right back to his front door. Her message was unmistakable. I was a contamination, a liability. I was not family, I was a danger to it, and she would be watching me very, very closely. The first direct threat didn't come with a bang, but with a quiet, digital vibration. My new phone buzzed on the granite countertop. It was a message from an unknown number. I opened it, my heart stopping cold. It was a photograph, crisp and clear, of Sophia. She was walking out of the front gates of her high school, laughing with a friend, her book bag slung over her shoulder. The photo was taken from across the street, from the perspective of someone sitting in a parked car. There was no text, no demand, just the image itself, a silent, screaming violation. The air rushed from my lungs. This was not a warning. It was a promise. They knew who she was. They knew where to find her. The fragile sense of safety I had begun to feel shattered into a million pieces. Forgetting all of Isabella's warnings, all of Leo's protocols, I ran from the apartment, clutching the phone like a weapon, my only thought to find Dante. He had brought this danger into our lives, and he was the only one who could stop it. I found him in his office, bursting through the heavy doors without knocking. I didn't say a word, just shoved the phone into his hand, my own shaking too violently to hold it steady. He looked at the screen, and for the first time, I saw the mask of calm control completely vanish from his face. It was replaced by something primal and terrifying, a cold, still fury that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching violently, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. He looked from the image of my sister to my tear-streaked, terrified face. In that instant, his rage seemed to recede, overshadowed by a wave of protective instinct so fierce it was almost tangible. He didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice was a low, deadly promise.
They will never get near her again. He spent the rest of the day on the phone, his voice a lethal monotone in Russian and Italian, unleashing forces I couldn't begin to comprehend. Later, he found me curled up on my couch and sat nearby, a silent, solid presence in the dark. "This is my fault," he said, the admission hanging between us. "I brought this to you. I will end it." The end of my illusion of safety arrived the next day in a simple cardboard box. It was delivered by a courier and addressed to me by name. Leo's security team scanned it for explosives and toxins, finding nothing before bringing it to my door with grim faces. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black tissue paper, was a dead dove. Its white feathers were pristine, except for a large, dark red stain soaking its breast. A stain that smelled sickeningly sweet, like the expensive wine from that fateful night at the restaurant. Tucked under its wing was a small, folded note. The words were printed in neat, impersonal block letters that made my blood run cold. "He can't protect every corner of your life. A debt is still a debt." It was a message from the Antonellis, a specter from Marco's sordid world reaching into mine. They were telling me that Dante's walls weren't high enough, that his power had limits. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were closing in. The sanctuary he had built for me had just become the most dangerous place on earth. Dante did not speak. He simply took the box from my hands, his gaze fixed on the dead dove, and a stillness fell over him that was more terrifying than any outburst of rage could ever be. He placed the lid back on the box with a chilling finality, his movements precise and economical. Then he looked at me, and his dark eyes were no longer unreadable. They were filled with a cold, murderous fury that was directed not at me, but at the world that had dared to touch what he now considered his. "Get ready," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You have an appointment for Sophia's follow-up this afternoon. I'm taking you." Leo, who had appeared silently in the doorway, began to protest.
"Sir, it's too exposed. Let me send a security detail." Dante cut him off with a single sharp glance. "No, I will handle this myself." There was no room for argument. He was drawing a line in the sand, declaring that this violation was personal. He was moving from a protector who offered a sanctuary to a predator who was about to go on the hunt, and he was taking me into the heart of the storm with him, a clear signal to his enemies that I was not a weakness to be exploited, but a territory under his direct and lethal command. The drive to the hospital was a masterclass in controlled tension. We were in one of his armored sedans, a silent, black beast gliding through city traffic. But the reinforced steel and bulletproof glass felt paper-thin against the weight of Dante's coiled rage. He drove himself, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors, the sidewalks, the rooftops. He was a hunter who knew he was also being hunted. I sat beside him, my own fear a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but it was strangely muted by his presence. It was a terrifying paradox. I had never been in more danger in my life, yet I had never felt so completely safe. At a red light, he turned to me, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. He reached over, not to touch me, but to adjust the collar of my coat, a small, almost paternal gesture that felt achingly intimate. "They won't touch you," he murmured, a promise that sounded like a vow. Or her. It was the first time he had acknowledged the threat so directly between us. And in that shared moment, the gilded cage he had built for me transformed into something else entirely. A shield held by a man willing to stand between me and the entire world. The attack came as we were leaving, not in the open street, but in the sterile, concrete confines of the hospital's private parking garage. One moment we were walking toward the car in the echoing quiet. The next, a black SUV with tinted windows screeched around the corner, its engine roaring like an enraged animal. Dante's reaction was instantaneous and fluid. He didn't hesitate, didn't think. He simply acted. He shoved me behind the solid concrete pillar, his body a solid wall shielding me from the impending impact, his arm wrapped around my head to protect me from the sound. The SUV slammed into the side of our sedan with a deafening shriek of tearing metal, pinning it against the wall. Doors flew open, and 3 large men spilled out, weapons drawn, their faces grim and purposeful. They weren't thugs, they were professionals. "Volkov," one of them shouted, his voice distorted by the garage's acoustics. "The Antonellis send their regards. Give us the girl, and we'll let you walk away." Dante didn't answer. He just pushed me further behind the pillar, drew his own weapon from inside his jacket, and the quiet garage was suddenly filled with the promise of imminent, calculated violence. What followed was not a fight. It was an execution. Dante moved from behind the pillar with a speed and grace that seemed inhuman, a blur of dark wool and lethal intent. He didn't waste motion, didn't posture. The first man went down with 2 silenced shots to the chest. So quick and quiet, he was on the ground before his partners even realized he'd been hit. The second man raised his weapon, but Dante was already on him, disarming him with a brutal twist of the wrist that was followed by a sickening crack of bone. I saw it all in flashes, a horrific ballet of violence that was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. This was the man who adjusted my collar, who spoke of his sister's medical treatments with such care, and he was a killer. The last man, seeing his companions neutralized, turned to run, but Dante was faster. He didn't shoot him in the back, he tackled him, and in the ensuing struggle, a wild shot was fired. I heard a sharp grunt of pain, a sound that cut through the chaos and sliced directly into my heart. He had been hit. The world seemed to stop as I watched him rise slowly, his left arm held tightly against his side, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The adrenaline that had frozen me in place shattered, replaced by a desperate, primal need to act. While Dante dealt with the last conscious attacker, securing him with a brutal efficiency that made my stomach churn, I scrambled out from behind the pillar. My eyes were locked on his left sleeve, where a dark, wet patch was rapidly spreading through the expensive fabric of his suit. "You're hurt," I breathed, the words feeling stupid and inadequate. He barely glanced down at it, his focus still on the threat, his senses on high alert. "It's a graze. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. His face was paler, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. Forgetting who he was, what he was, I ripped a long strip from the hem of my blouse and stepped toward him. He tensed, his body language screaming for me to stay back, to remain the protected asset. But I ignored it. "Hold still," I commanded, my voice shaking but firm. To my utter shock, he obeyed. He stood perfectly still as I wrapped the makeshift bandage tightly around his bicep, my fingers clumsy but determined. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. I was no longer the wounded bird. I was tending to the wounded dragon, and he was letting me. He didn't take me back to the glittering prison of his tower. Instead, he drove for nearly an hour, out of the city, the skyscrapers and noise, giving way to winding country roads and the deep, silent woods of my childhood. He finally pulled up to a large wrought iron gate, half swallowed by ivy. It opened silently, and we drove down a long gravel path to a beautiful old stone house, clearly long abandoned, but still holding an air of faded grandeur. It was surrounded by overgrown gardens and ancient oak trees. "Where are we?" I whispered, the place feeling both sacred and haunted. He cut the engine, and the silence was absolute. "My home," he said, and the word sounded foreign on his lips. "The one I grew up in, before my father built his empire. Before—" He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the house as if seeing ghosts in its dark windows. He had brought me to the heart of his past, a place far more private and vulnerable than his sterile penthouse. He wasn't just hiding me from his enemies. He was showing me where his own wounds were buried, a place of origin for the man he had become, a place he clearly hadn't shared with anyone for a very long time. Inside, the house was draped in white sheets, a mausoleum of memories. Dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon light cutting through the grimy windows. Dante walked directly to the mantelpiece in the grand, decaying living room and picked up a single silver picture frame, wiping the dust from the glass with his thumb. He stared at it for a long moment before turning it toward me. It was a photo of a teenage boy with his arm around a vibrant, laughing girl who shared his dark eyes and sharp cheekbones. "My sister, Anya," he said, his voice raw with an old, unhealed grief. "She was 17. She fell in love with a man who seemed charming. My father hated him, saw the poison in him, but she wouldn't listen. I was just a kid. I thought my father was just being controlling." He paused, his jaw tight. "He started with bruises she would hide with makeup. Then he broke her arm, told everyone she fell down the stairs. I knew. I saw it. But I did nothing. I was afraid of him, afraid of my father's wrath if I interfered. A week later, he killed her. He pushed her from a balcony and called it a suicide." He looked from the photo to me, his eyes burning with a self-hatred that was 1,000 times more terrifying than his anger. "That is my code, Elena. I failed her. I will not fail you." The confession hung in the dusty air between us, a fragile, shattering truth that recontextualized everything I knew about him. His protection, his control, his violence, it was all penance. He was trying to save me, to absolve the ghost of the sister he couldn't. I reached out, my fingers gently covering his on the picture frame, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. We were no longer a mafia boss and his ward. We were two broken people, bound by a shared understanding of loss and survival. In that moment, I knew I was irreversibly tied to him, not by debt or gratitude, but by this devastating glimpse into his soul. The spell was broken by the sharp, intrusive buzz of his phone. It was Leo. Dante answered, his voice regaining its usual clipped authority, but I saw the new weight in his shoulders. He listened for a long time, his expression hardening into something bleak and cold. "I see," he said finally, and hung up. He turned to me, his face grim. "The men in the garage."
They were Antonelli's, but they were hired by Marco. My blood ran cold. He told them everything, Dante continued, his voice dangerously low. Your routines, Sophia's school schedule, and one other thing. He told them Anya's name. He told them exactly how to hurt me. The name. He had used her name. Marco, in his pathetic, cowardly betrayal, had given my ghost to Dante's enemies. He had handed them the key, not just to a past tragedy, but to the very architecture of Dante's soul, the blueprint for his pain. The knowledge was a physical weight, pressing the air from my lungs. I looked at Dante, at the man who had just shared the most broken part of himself with me, and I saw the mask of the stoic leader slam back into place, but I could see the cracks spiderwebbing beneath the surface. He was no longer looking at me. He was looking through me, at a past he could never fix, and a present that was now poisoned by it. The silence on the drive back to the city was no longer a space of shared understanding, but a vast, cold chasm that had opened between us. I was no longer a person he was protecting. I had become a living effigy of his greatest failure, a weapon his enemies now knew exactly how to aim. The guilt was a suffocating shroud, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Isabella had been right all along. I was a stray that had led the entire wolf pack to his door. We returned to a penthouse that no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a war room on the verge of being overrun. The air was thick with a new, sharper tension. Leo was waiting, his arm in a sling, his face pale and etched with pain and fury. He explained in clipped, precise tones that the Antonellis, emboldened and armed with Marco's intimate knowledge of the Volkov operations, had struck a major shipping hub at the docks. It was a brazen, unprecedented assault on Dante's territory, a crippling financial blow designed to cause chaos and signal a shift in power. But the cost was more than financial. Leo had been there, and in the ensuing firefight, he had taken a bullet meant for someone else. He brushed it off as a minor inconvenience, but I saw the way Dante's jaw tightened, the flicker of cold rage in his eyes as he looked at his most loyal friend, wounded because of a war I had brought into their lives. This was the consequence, tangible and bleeding. The fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a weakness, a vulnerability that had a name, and that name was Elena Martinez. I was the poison that was sickening the entire system from the inside out. Isabella Volkov's arrival was as silent and inevitable as the turning of a season to winter. She didn't knock, she simply appeared in the doorway, a figure of regal fury, her eyes bypassing her wounded son to land on me with the force of a physical blow. She didn't need to speak. Her entire being screamed condemnation. "I warned you," she finally said, her voice a low, chilling whisper of perfectly enunciated English, meant for me and me alone, even as she looked at her son. She then switched to harsh, guttural Russian, spitting words at Dante that I didn't need to understand to feel their sting. Words like weakness, sentiment, and the one I recognized with a jolt of ice in my veins, Anya. Dante's replies were low and strained, a king being dressed down by the Queen Mother. She saw me as the source of the infection, the fatal flaw in her son's armor. "He is losing his focus, his empire, because of you," she said, turning her full, icy attention to me. "If you have any decency, any gratitude for what he has done, you will remove yourself. You will disappear." The command was absolute, a final, crushing confirmation of the guilt that was already devouring me whole. After she left, a storm of silence descended. Dante tried to bridge the gap, his voice rough with exhaustion and something I couldn't name. "Don't listen to her, Alina. This is not your fault. I will handle this."
but the words felt like echoes from a distant room. He was already gone, lost in the calculations of war, his phone pressed to his ear as he gave orders in a voice that was pure, cold steel. The man who had shown me his sister's photograph, who had let me bandage his wound, had vanished, replaced by the ruthless leader his world demanded. And I saw the devastating truth. My presence didn't just endanger him, it fractured him. It forced him to fight a war on two fronts, one against the Antonellis and one against the heart his mother warned he couldn't afford. The greatest threat to him wasn't the men with guns. It was the quiet moments of connection we shared, the vulnerability he allowed himself with me. Protecting him was making him weak, and if I stayed, my love, and his for me, would be the very thing that destroyed him. I had to save him from myself, and there was only one way to do that. My decision was forged in the crucible of that terrible, suffocating guilt. I had to become a ghost. While Dante was locked away in his office, a general commanding his troops, I moved through the silent apartment like a thief. My hands shook as I wrote the note, each word a fresh tear in my heart. I told him I couldn't be the weapon they used against him, that I was leaving to draw their fire, to become a target so far from him and Sophia that they would be safe. It was a lie and a prayer. I left the note on the cold marble of the kitchen island, a final, sterile goodbye. My escape plan was a desperate gamble, relying on a half-remembered conversation with Leo about an emergency service exit, a blind spot in the tower's otherwise impenetrable security. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren from the city below sounded like an alarm heralding my betrayal. I wasn't just running from the Antonellis, I was running from the only man who had ever made me feel safe. And the agony of that choice was a physical pain, a tearing away of a part of my soul I had only just discovered. I found the service corridor, a dark, narrow passage that smelled of dust and disinfectant. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down my final seconds in his world. But as my hand reached for the heavy steel bar of the exit door, a figure melted out of the deeper shadows ahead. My breath caught in my throat, expecting one of Dante's guards, expecting to be dragged back in failure. Instead, it was one of Isabella's men, his face impassive but for a flicker of something that might have been pity in his eyes. "Mrs. Volkov sends her regrets," he said, his voice a low, professional murmur. "She believed you would do the honorable thing. A car is waiting to take you to a private airstrip. From there, you will be given a new life far away from all of this. It is her gift to you and to her son." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't an escape. It was an exile, orchestrated by the Queen herself. She was cutting me out of Dante's life with surgical precision, ensuring he would believe I had simply abandoned him in his darkest hour. The betrayal was absolute, a cold, clean cut severing me from him forever. I numbly followed him to the waiting car, a black sedan that felt like a hearse for the life I was leaving behind. As it pulled silently away from the curb, I stared up at the tower, at the single floor of light that had been my entire world, now impossibly distant. A vibration in my coat pocket made me jump. The burner phone. A message from an unknown number. My fingers were stiff and cold as I opened it. There was no text, only a short, grainy video file. It showed a familiar street corner, the one near Sophia's school. I saw her, laughing, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Then, a dark van screeched to a halt beside her. 2 men jumped out. Her laughter died, replaced by a scream that was silenced as they shoved her inside and the van sped away. The video ended. My phone vibrated again. A single line of text appeared, burning itself into my brain. "You run, he's distracted. A debt is still a debt." They knew. They had been waiting for me. My desperate, noble act of self-sacrifice had not protected anyone. It had been the final, fatal move that had just handed my sister over to the monsters. I was alone, being driven to oblivion, while the only person I loved was now their prisoner. The video froze on my sister's terrified face, a silent scream forever trapped on the tiny screen. The driver, Isabella's stoic enforcer, glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. For a single, paralyzing moment, I was nothing but a vessel of pure, helpless horror. Then, something inside me, something that had been beaten down and silenced for years, ignited into a white-hot, diamond-hard rage. I was done being a victim. I was done being a pawn. "Stop the car," I said, my voice eerily calm, a dead sea before a tsunami. He ignored me, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, following his orders. I said, "Stop the car now," I shouted, lunging forward and yanking the emergency brake. The sedan screeched and swerved violently, the smell of burning rubber filling the air. Before the car had even come to a complete stop, I threw open the door and scrambled out, hitting the pavement hard but rolling with the momentum. The driver yelled my name, but I was already on my feet, sprinting back toward the city lights, the burner phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. I wasn't running away anymore. I was running back into the fire, because my sister was in there, and I was the only one who could feel which way the flames were burning. Dante found my note exactly 3 minutes after I disappeared from his building's surveillance feeds. He read the carefully chosen words, a confession of a noble sacrifice that felt like the sharpest betrayal he had ever known. His mother's warnings echoed in the sterile silence of the penthouse, a cold chorus of "I told you so." The pain was a physical blow, a confirmation of his deepest fear, that to love was to create a weakness, an opening for the enemy to strike. He was still staring at my handwriting when Leo burst in, his face grim, phone extended. The video of Sophia's abduction played without sound, but Dante heard her scream in his soul. And in that instant, everything shifted. My note wasn't a betrayal, it was a battle plan, a flawed, desperate attempt to protect him. My absence wasn't an abandonment, it was a target painted on my own back. The grief curdled into something colder, purer, and infinitely more dangerous. He turned to Leo, his eyes like chips of black ice. "Find the van, find my cameras on that street, find every known Antonelli associate and burn their lives to the ground until one of them talk," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal hum. "And find her, find Elena.
She's walking into a trap, and I'm not letting her face it alone." I couldn't go to the police. I couldn't go back to the tower. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer mine, and every shadow felt like a threat. My only weapon was my memory, a detailed archive of the man who had started all of this, Marco. I knew the dingy sports bar where he placed his bets, the corner store where he bought his cheap cigars, the specific brand of whiskey he drank when he was celebrating a petty victory. The Antonellis were professionals, but they were using a cowardly, predictable amateur for their intelligence. They would use his knowledge, his old haunts, the places he felt comfortable. So I started there, in the grimy underbelly of the city he called home. I moved from one sordid location to the next, my fear a constant, metallic taste in my mouth, but my purpose was a shield. I showed his picture, asked quiet questions, piecing together a trail from whispers and nervous glances. I wasn't the waitress from Volkov's anymore. I was a hunter, using the intimate knowledge of my abuser not as a source of trauma, but as a map that would lead me straight to the heart of the enemy's territory. I was no longer waiting for a rescuer. I was clearing the path for an army. Dante's technological superiority and my street-level pursuit were two halves of a pincer movement, destined to close on the same point. His analysts, using traffic cameras and facial recognition, tracked the kidnapper's van to an abandoned fish processing plant in the industrial district, a property owned by an Antonelli shell corporation. It was a known dead zone, a place for business best conducted in the dark. At the same moment, a terrified, low-level bookie, remembering the name of a warehouse Marco used to brag about for his side deals, gave me the same address.
I arrived on a stolen bicycle minutes before Dante's silent, black-clad team, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. From behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, I saw them, the armored vans, the disciplined soldiers moving into position. I saw Marco's pathetic, beat-up sedan parked near a side entrance. Sophia was in there. I knew it in my bones. But I also knew that a full frontal assault, no matter how well planned, was a chaotic gamble. A stray bullet, a moment of panic, and I would lose her forever. I had to go in first. I had to be the distraction they would never see coming. My chance came in the form of a forgotten memory. A summer, I worked a temp job packing boxes in this very warehouse. A miserable job I'd tried to erase from my mind. I remembered a rusted-out ventilation hatch near the loading box, too small for a man in tactical gear, but just big enough for me. I slipped through it, my movements silent, my body fueled by a terror so profound it felt like courage. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of stale fish and fear. I found them in the center of the vast, cavernous space. Sophia, tied to a steel chair, her face streaked with tears, and Marco, arguing with a cold-eyed man who was clearly his superior. "She's leverage, you idiot, not your personal plaything," the man snarled. Marco, desperate to reassert some pathetic shred of control, turned and raised his hand to my sister. That's when I stepped from the shadows. "Marco!" I screamed, my voice echoing like a gunshot in the silence. Every head turned. In that moment of shocked stillness, the main doors exploded inward. The warehouse filled with the disciplined chaos of Dante's assault. But Dante wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at me, standing defenseless between his war and the only thing in the world that mattered. He broke formation. He abandoned strategy. Seeing Marco lunge toward me, Dante moved with a singular, primal purpose, a dark missile of protective fury crossing the open floor. He reached me a fraction of a second before Marco did, his intervention not a fight, but a final, brutal full stop to the man who had haunted my life. The rest of the Antonelli crew was subdued with ruthless efficiency by his men, the firefight over almost as soon as it began. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the scent of gunpowder and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Dante didn't bark orders or survey his victory. He walked directly to me, his dark eyes ignoring everything else in the room. He pulled me and a sobbing Sophia into an embrace so tight it felt like he was trying to fuse us all into a single, unbreakable unit. When he finally pulled back, his hands framed my face, his gaze searching mine for an answer to a question he didn't need to ask. "You came back," he breathed, his voice raw with 1,000 emotions. "I was never going to leave you," I answered, my voice clear and steady. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of our enemies, we were not a boss and his ward, or a savior and his victim. We were a choice, mutually and irrevocably made. We were home. The silence that followed the storm was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. In the weeks after the warehouse, the world Dante commanded shifted on its axis. The Antonelli family, decapitated and disgraced, crumbled into dust, their territories absorbed or simply erased. Leo, his arm healing in a sling, but his eyes sharp as ever, would give me quiet, clipped updates. Marco, he explained one afternoon, had not been killed. Dante's justice was more poetic.
He was now working off a new, unpayable debt in a bleak, isolated fish cannery in Alaska, a place where his cruelty would be met with the unyielding indifference of a frozen sea. The news brought not joy, but a profound, quiet sense of closure. The penthouse, once a fortress under siege, softened into a home. The tension bled from the walls, replaced by the sound of Sophia's laughter as she regained her strength, her medical treatments now a simple routine rather than a desperate monthly battle. Dante moved with a new lightness, the weight of a lifelong war seemingly lifted from his shoulders. He was still the king of a dangerous kingdom, but now the gates were closed, the drawbridge was up, and inside, for the first time, there was peace. My own transformation felt slower, like a flower unfurling after a long winter. I couldn't go back to being a waitress, but the thought of living as a kept woman in a gilded cage was even more unbearable. I found my purpose back where it all began, at Volkov's. Dante had closed it after the incident, but I asked him to give it to me, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. I spent a month rebuilding it from the inside out, not just the decor, but the very soul of the place. I rehired the 2 other servers Marco had tormented, offering them salaries and respect he had denied them. I changed the menu, the lighting, the entire atmosphere, turning it from a place of cold, exclusive power into one of warmth and welcome. Dante would visit in the late afternoons, standing quietly by the bar, watching me direct the staff or taste a new dish. He never interfered, never offered a single command. He just watched, and in his dark, quiet eyes, I saw not the possessiveness of a boss, but the profound respect of a partner who was witnessing the woman he loved build her own empire right next to his. The true healing happened far from the city, in the quiet, dusty rooms of his childhood home. We started spending weekends there, airing out the ghosts. We tore down the old faded drapes and let the sunlight pour in, illuminating the potential for a new life within the old stone walls. Dante, a man who commanded armies with a single word, was surprisingly gentle with a paintbrush in his hand. We worked side by side, our silences comfortable, our conversations easy. One afternoon, he found me planting a garden where only weeds had grown for decades. He came and knelt in the dirt beside me, his large, scarred hands surprisingly careful as he helped me settle a young rosebush into the earth. Sophia would join us, her laughter echoing through the ancient oaks as she chased butterflies, her illness a fading memory. In those moments, he wasn't Dante Volkov, the formidable leader of a criminal empire. He was just Dante, a man learning to rebuild his own heart, tending to a new garden, and finally, after a lifetime of penance and solitude, allowing himself to be part of a family that had chosen him right back. Tonight, the old stone house is filled with the scent of roasting chicken and the sound of Sophia arguing playfully with Dante over a game of chess. The fire crackles in the hearth we rebuilt together, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. I stand in the doorway of the kitchen, watching them, and a wave of peace so profound it almost brings me to my knees washes over me. I see the woman I was, her hands trembling as she polished that wine glass, trapped in a cycle of fear and humiliation, and she feels like a stranger from another lifetime. Dante looks up, his eyes meeting mine across the room, and the quiet smile he gives me holds more love and security than I ever thought possible. He didn't just save me from my life, he gave me the strength to build a new one, brick by painful brick. We found our justice not in revenge, but in this, in the quiet, simple, unshakable reality of a safe home. It's a reminder that even after the most brutal storms, a second chance can take root. And it's stories like this, of finding light in the darkest of places, that give us all a reason to keep fighting.